I mean, obviously, it's quite a broad question. But I think the first thing to say is that really, since 1971, when Friends of the Earth started, it has been, as far as I'm aware, very, very science-driven. And what has tended to happen is that things that Friends of the Earth point out, some decades later, finally become fully established. I mean, Friends of the Earth started immediately working on issues like recycling. And I have to say, in this country, it's taken quite a long time for recycling to pick up from there. And I remember the days when the concept of an aspirational target of 25% recycling was considered completely unrealistic and totally impossible. And I think there's now some evidence that that's not the case. So science is a really important basis because, in general, when you're analysing the environmental problems, it is science at the basis of your understanding. But also it's important to consider the socio-political environment, because just because science has shown something, it doesn't mean that society is going to do anything about it. And there are very good, strong economic interests in society and other reasons why things don't necessarily happen, even though you demonstrate a problem. And it's also important to realise the limits of science. And the fact that basically science is about exploring uncertainty. People at school may view science as a list of facts, but of course the reality of science is that scientists don't spend their lives memorising facts. They spend their time finding out about new things. And I used to work on chemicals policy, and there this was a huge issue because you would have an argument about whether you were able to prove that a chemical would harm a child in the womb. And one side would say, well, you haven't got any proof that it happens to humans. And the other side would say, well, if you think about it, how do you get proof that a chemical harms a child in the womb? You get two groups, ideally randomly selected of pregnant women, you expose them to the chemical, and then you track them for the next 40 years or so to discover how the child develops. Now, obviously, that's quite difficult to do. And occasionally, these experiments have ended up being done in the environment. I mean, thalidomide is a classic example where there was a clear thing. And some areas you get much easier, you get unique illnesses, and asbestos is a classic one. But even then, there's a very good report from the European Environment Agency from some years ago called Late Lessons from Early Warnings that actually looks at this issue of when the science first discovered or highlighted problems on things like asbestos, but also many other issues like ozone depletion, and then how long it took before things were done. And we still have a situation where there are still people fighting for asbestos and how wonderful it is. They tend to be Canadians because that's where they mine it, which emphasises the importance of economic interests in these debates. I think an example, one of the strange things I find on the linking of science and the sort of general public domain is how unimportant science generally is in the public domain. And a real example that really shocked me, I think, was quite a number of years ago, the Sunday Times, then being edited by Andrew Neil, with a science correspondent called Neville Hodgkinson, decided to run a campaign that HIV didn't cause AIDS. This was at the same time as the Revolutionary Communist Party, through Living Marxism, was doing it, which was quite strange. And they ran this campaign week after week, and Nature, which is a pretty conservative journal, ended up publishing letters and analysis every week because the Sunday Times wouldn't publish the letters from scientists that disagreed with their campaign. And so the Nature was publishing these letters. And so that campaign, carried on, eventually died off. I'm not exactly sure why. And you think, so therefore, Andrew Neil was the editor. He knew that these letters were coming in. He knew that there was debate. So has Andrew Neil's career been affected? Is he sort of a pariah for the work he did on HIV and the millions of people who died from HIV? And interestingly, apparently not. So the place of science is quite bizarre in society. So I think, just to come back to the waste industry, you see a lot of things become received in wisdom. Something burns, therefore burning it will help us in the fight against climate change. That's often, it seems to be an approach, and there was a very good paper a few months ago from Sweden looking at the burning of plastics versus landfilling of plastics, and saying that in most circumstances in Sweden it would be better to landfill plastics than burn them, because incineration in Sweden was so inefficient, and because we weren't just going in and replacing 100% coal It wasn't 100% coal power in Sweden that was being replaced. Therefore, the idea that burning plastic was a good thing, when plastic is only basically oil, was just wrong. And so there's all sorts of examples. I won't go into more examples at this point. They'll probably come up in the discussion. But there was just a specific question on how to find trusted info. I have to say, in my approach, I usually say, ideally, are there any references? And if there are, can I have a look at them? At least the abstract. Is it in a real journal? Is it a real sign of evidence? Or is there, as happened to me when I was working on chemicals some years ago, I received a whole set of postcards were sent in to Friends of the Earth, all with a picture of a hand on the cover. And at the back it said that people's hands had been getting bigger and bigger, and this was down to chemicals. Which was really interesting because there was no contact information on the postcard. There was no references or anything. And I never had the time to actually try and follow it up. But my feeling was that was actually probably something coming from industry to try and persuade us to put out something saying, oh, look, we've received a postcard saying this, therefore it must be true. But their naivety about our approach to science was quite noticeable. Thank you.